There is a short list of people in this sport whose opinion carries genuine weight, not commentators, not those who have never competed at a serious level. The people on that list have stood on stage in peak condition, measured against the best physiques the sport has ever seen. At the top of that list is a man from Birmingham, England, who won 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles and has spent the 3 decades since saying very little publicly. Dorian Yates has never been drawn to self-promotion. He trained in a basement gym. He competed with precision and consistency. When he left the sport, he left quietly. That reputation for restraint is part of what earned him the name The Shadow. So when, at 64, he addresses the question bodybuilding has debated since the 1990s, who was the most dominant Mr. Olympia of all time, it is worth taking seriously. This is not a retired athlete seeking relevance. This is the competitor who defined the mass era of professional bodybuilding, offering a direct and considered answer that reflects the same character as his 6 title runs. His answer was not what most observers expected, and the most striking part of it concerned himself. To understand why his perspective carries particular weight, it helps to consider what most of these conversations lack. The Mr. Olympia debate is ongoing. Fans and former competitors engage with it constantly, but most of those discussions share a common limitation. They involve people who were not present during the eras being compared, or who observed them only from the outside. Dorian Yates was not on the outside. From 1992 to 1997, he was the central figure against which every other professional bodybuilder was measured. 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, a professional record of 15 major contest wins, with only 2 second-place finishes across his entire career. He won every contest he entered from 1992 until retirement. In 1997, he competed with a torn tricep sustained 3 weeks before the show, and still won. From the moment he became champion to the moment he chose to retire, he was never defeated. That is an unbroken 6-year hold on the top title in professional bodybuilding. The training system behind that record was, by the standards of the era, highly unconventional. His blood and guts philosophy was built on high-intensity training principles developed by Arthur Jones and Mike Mentzer. Yates trained 4 days a week, spending 45 minutes to an hour per session, performing 1 or 2 working sets per exercise. While most competitors were logging hours of high-volume work, his sessions were comparatively brief, and yet the size and conditioning he brought to the stage each year exceeded what his competition could produce. His back development in particular, the width, the thickness, and the degree of muscular separation became one of the most analyzed and discussed physical attributes in the history of competitive bodybuilding. The word strongest is complicated when applied to Mr. Olympia. The competition does not test strength directly. There is no platform, no barbell loaded to maximum, no qualifying total. Men are judged on appearance, the size of the muscle, its condition, symmetry, and stage presence. A champion could theoretically win while being significantly weaker in the gym than a runner-up. Strength and aesthetics are related, but they are not the same measurement. What makes the question worth examining rather than dismissing is this. The men who have won the Mr. Olympia multiple times are, almost without exception, also among the strongest bodybuilders who ever competed. Building that level of muscle, sustaining it across years of competition, arriving on stage at 260 or 280 or 300 pounds with near single-digit body fat, none of that happens without moving serious weight. The Sandow Trophy and the squat rack are not as separate as people tend to assume. The record supports this. Arnold Schwarzenegger deadlifted 617 pounds as a young powerlifter, before he was a household name. Lee Haney, 8-time champion through the 1980s, trained with a volume and intensity that would be difficult for most athletes to sustain. Phil Heath, 7-time champion from 2011 to 2017, was known for training with weights that appeared disproportionate to his frame. Jay Cutler, 4-time champion, squatted and pressed numbers that consistently drew attention. And then there are the 2 men who anchor this debate, the 6-time champion who opened the mass monster era, and the 8-time champion who extended what Dorian built to a level that has not been replicated since. Dorian Yates versus Ronnie Coleman. That is the central argument. In January 2026, Yates addressed his side of it directly. On January 7, 2026, Dorian Yates posted to Instagram and laid out his assessments of hypothetical cross-era matchups between the sport's greatest champions. He addressed them one by one, without the diplomatic hedging that most retired competitors use when asked these questions. No deference to error, no deflection about the impossibility of comparison, direct assessments from someone with no remaining competitive stakes, and no reason to be careful with his words. He began with some of the more historically significant matchups. On Jay Cutler versus Frank Zane, the 4-time champion of the Mass Monster era against the 3-time champion of the Golden era, Yates was straightforward. Zane competed under a different standard, and Cutler at his peak represented a level of muscular development that did not exist during Zane's era. In a direct comparison at their respective bests, Yates concluded the modern competitor wins because the sport evolved. He acknowledged Sergio Oliva, known as the Myth, the dominant champion of the late 1960s, widely regarded as one of the most genetically exceptional competitors in the sport's history, as someone who was genuinely ahead of his time. In a head-to-head against a prime Jay Cutler, however, Yates gave the edge to the modern era. Then came the question of Phil Heath versus Lee Haney. Dorian's answer was more nuanced and more personal. He said that if you placed both men on stage at their absolute best, Phil Heath probably wins, because Heath's level of muscle maturity, density, and conditioning represented another step forward from Haney's era. But he added something that spoke directly to where he stands in the aesthetics debate: I prefer Lee Haney's physique. Dorian Yates, a competitor who faced consistent criticism throughout his career for being too massive, for pushing the sport too far towards size, said he prefers the more proportional, classically built physique of the man who beat him in 1991. It is an honest position and a quiet critique of the direction the sport took. He was then asked about the matchup between himself and Lee Haney. He acknowledged that Haney beat him in 1991 and said that result was correct given where he was in his development at that time. But when comparing both men at their respective peaks, Dorian in 1993 or 1994 against Haney at his best, he said he would win. His competitive confidence on that question was clear. There was, however, one name where that confidence yielded to a different judgment. Probably Ronnie. He's the only one I'd say that. My competitive ego doesn't like it, but probably he would beat me. That is the direct quote. From Dorian Yates, it carries considerable weight. Yates never lost the Mr. Olympia during his competitive career. He defended his title through serious injury, and at 64, with 6 titles to his name, he identified one competitor, out of every champion in the sport's history, who he believes would have beaten him on stage. That competitor is Ronnie Coleman. Some context matters here. Dorian and Ronnie never competed against each other directly. Their careers did not overlap at peak. Coleman was rising through the ranks as Yates was finishing his run, and by the time Coleman won his first Olympia in 1998, Yates had already retired. This is not a concession based on a result that actually occurred. It is a considered judgment made by someone who knows what it takes to dominate that stage, and who has studied Coleman's physique with the perspective of someone who built his own body to be the competitive standard. Dorian was also asked who would win between Ronnie Coleman and Arnold Schwarzenegger. His answer was straightforward: Coleman. He said Arnold was head and shoulders above everybody in his era, an acknowledgement of how dominant Schwarzenegger was relative to his contemporaries. But placed on stage together at their absolute best, he said Coleman wins, and by a significant margin. That is Dorian Yates naming Ronnie Coleman the greatest competitor in the sport's history, stated directly and without qualification. To understand the reasoning behind Dorian Yates' assessment, it helps to look closely at what Ronnie Coleman was actually doing in the gym, because from a raw strength standpoint, the case for him as the strongest Mr. Olympia competitor in history is difficult to dispute. Ronnie Coleman squatted 800 pounds for 2 repetitions, not in a powerlifting competition, with specialized equipment, wraps, and a monolift, not as a maximum single attempt following a competition-specific peaking cycle. This was a training session, performed with a standard weight belt in a commercial bodybuilding gym in Arlington, Texas, in the weeks leading up to a Mr. Olympia competition. The video of that squat has been viewed more than 61 million times on YouTube, making it one of the most watched pieces of fitness footage in internet history. Coleman's own estimate was that he had the capacity for 6 repetitions at that weight. His deadlift numbers were comparable. Coleman pulled 800 pounds for a double in training, and based on documented footage and the progression of his lifts over the years, his estimated 1-rep maximum on the deadlift approached the mid-800s. Earlier in his career, he competed in powerlifting, pulling 727.5 pounds in the 242-pound class in 1992, at a body weight roughly 60 pounds below his later Olympia competition weight. His estimated powerlifting total, calculated from his best documented training lifts across the squat, bench, and deadlift, has been placed at over 2,200 pounds. His bench press reached 500 pounds for multiple repetitions. Documented training footage shows him barbell rowing 495 pounds. This was not a bodybuilder who periodically moved heavy weights for the camera. Coleman trained with the volume and intensity of a powerlifter, consistently across years, while maintaining the conditioning required to compete on the Olympia stage at close to 300 pounds. At his 2003 peak, widely considered his best condition, he weighed approximately 287 pounds in competition shape, held 8 Olympia titles, and visibly outsized every other professional bodybuilder on stage. That is the competitor Dorian Yates identified as the one person capable of beating him. It is worth being precise on this point. Dorian Yates was not a weak competitor. His blood and guts training philosophy was built around sets taken to complete muscular failure using moderate to heavy weights, not around loading a bar to its maximum for a single attempt. A direct numerical comparison between his training lifts and Coleman's strength peaks is not a clean one-to-one comparison. The numbers that do exist from Yates' training, however, remain substantial by any standard. In documented training footage, Dorian was performing bent-over rows with over 400 pounds, working sets, not max attempts. His hack squats reached 660 pounds for working reps. His 45-degree leg press went to 1,265 pounds. His incline bench reached 425 pounds for 8 repetitions. His deadlift performed last in his back workouts, with a partial range of motion to keep tension on the back rather than the legs, reached 455 pounds for 6 reps with straps. Calculated for full range of motion and maximum effort, that projects to an estimated true max somewhere in the range of 525 to 530 pounds. One analysis, extrapolating from his 1985 squat numbers along the same development arc, suggested his peak squat max could have approached the 700s. By any general standard, those are elite strength numbers. Against most people on the planet, Dorian Yates is an outlier. But measured against Ronnie Coleman's 800-pound squat, 800-pound deadlift, and 500-pound bench for multiple reps, the gap is substantial. Dorian has acknowledged this himself. The competitive instinct resists the conclusion, as he put it, but his honest assessment is unambiguous. Coleman operated in a different weight class entirely. Dorian said as much directly. The discussion becomes more nuanced from there, because Dorian's position is not simply about raw numbers. If it were, Coleman would be the clear answer and the matter would be settled. But listening carefully to how Dorian frames the question in his January 2026 Instagram breakdown and in earlier interviews, the word strongest is carrying more than one meaning. In interviews, he has used a phrase that captures his broader view of what separated the best champions. Proportion, size, conditioning, the whole mix. That phrase is the operative one. A competitor can squat 800 pounds and still not represent the strongest package on stage if his conditioning doesn't match his size, if his muscle maturity is underdeveloped, or if his structure fails to display the mass effectively under competition conditions. In the context of the Olympia, strength is understood as a complete expression, the full package at its maximum on the day it counts. By that standard, the whole mix. Dorian still awards it to Coleman. The size was historically significant. The conditioning matched the size in a way that was, by the standards of the sport, anomalous. The structure carried the muscle in a way that made competitors of similar body weight appear noticeably smaller. And the longevity was without precedent. 8 consecutive title defenses against some of the deepest competitive fields the sport had seen, sustaining that level year after year. Dorian also said something in that conversation that his supporters should not overlook. Describing the era he and Coleman represented, he offered an assessment that was both historical record and quiet acknowledgement of what had passed. Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, Coleman. There's nobody that can match those guys in proportion, size, conditioning, the whole mix. He was not only recognizing Coleman, he was defining a generation, his generation, competing through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, and stating that it represented a standard the sport has not reached since. The current generation, in Dorian's view, is capable, but it is not that.